All right, Becky, I think we have a good amount now. Welcome, everybody. This is Heather Riggs with the New England Museum Association. Welcome today for our financial management part 2. I hope you guys all were able to join us for part 1. Becky did a great job explaining a lot of the stuff that's going on. And today she'll be doing a follow-up on new things, new questions. Definitely, if you guys do have some questions, go ahead and type them in the chat feature or the Q&A section. And if you want to type in the chat feature, if you want to be social, go ahead and type where you're actually viewing this from. That would be great. Make sure you do it to all panelists and attendees so we can all see it. Or you can be private and just send it to me. That's fine too. And then I would like to mention that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the NEMA website later on this afternoon, just in case you have to leave early, want a refresher, want to share it with someone else. So that's always available, along with all of our other webinars and town halls and stuff like that are also available to view through the NEMA website. Just go to the conferencing events and webinar workshops, and you'll see a link to our YouTube page with all of that information on it. So Becky, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Heather. Well, welcome everyone. It's good to see you all. If you would like to, please make sure that you are introducing yourself so I can say hi to all of you and welcome you. Some of you I'm already seeing were able to join us for the first session. If you were not able to, I'm sure that you can talk to Heather to access that first session. And while this is a continuation of the conversation and we'll be focusing on some different topics than we did with the first session, I am also more than happy to address any questions that people may have. We are happy to reiterate any information in the first session. If you missed that and you have questions, just let me know. As Heather mentioned, in the Q&A box is the perfect place to put in questions that you may have. And I can see that right here on my screen and answer anything that you may have as we're going. And so I just want to welcome everyone. As Heather said, my name is Beaulieu. I am a board member of the New England Museum Association. I do a lot of work with AASLH and with NEMA in terms of financial management, which is a topic that we all just love so much, right? And we just can't get enough of. We recognize that finance is something that can be daunting. It can make us nervous. But this is a time that we all recognize that the standards are changing. We in the museum field not only are invited to be knowledgeable about finance, it is warranted, it is necessary, and in a situation like we're facing right now in our field, it is absolutely vital to survival. So something that we've been doing in these conversations, and that I really appreciate Heather and the whole NEMA team for having me, is just to build our comfort to talk about some of the particular concerns when you're dealing with financial management during a crisis situation. So for those of you who were able to join us in the first session, as you may remember, I consider myself a facilitator. I am sharing information with you. I don't necessarily know the answer to everything, but I will do my darn to be able to provide you some useful direction and really to just get you thinking productively and strategically rather than getting in that frozen state where you just know that you should be thinking about things. So in our previous discussion, we talked about business disruption and emergency planning. We talked about the financial needs of what to build into emergency planning. Today, we'll talk about that a little bit different as we consider business resumption planning. We also talked about financial modeling and scenario planning, specifically a review of particular sources of income, how those may change and fluctuate during a time like we're facing right now, endowment management and considerations in terms of your endowment, both in terms of a regular distribution, its valuation, and then future planning, as well as restricted versus unrestricted use, and then timeline considerations. Today, what I'd like to do is to offer that any of those topics, if something pings you, ask me a question and we can happily go back and talk about something we may have in the past. I assure you, you are not the only person to have any question, so feel free to ask. And today what I'm going to do is take us through a conversation picking up with budget revisions and how to be looking at that both in terms of the current year and then also thinking about the future, business resumption planning, general communications with stakeholders, with trustees, and then with your staff, and how to be planning for that as well. And then any other considerations for post-crisis planning that I think would be useful to mention. Many of these are directly financially related and others have financial implications. So we'll kind of spread a wide swath here in terms of what we're covering. And as I offered, please feel free to ask any questions you have. The way that this works, I'll just keep on talking. And so hopefully you'll get something out of that, but chime in here if there is anything that you wish. So let's get started and let's start talking about budget revisions. So I think one of the things that we talked about last time that was very helpful, and as people were dealing with the immediate repercussions of the virus pandemic and also dealing with the closure that resulted from that health concern, was to be talking about cash flow. And so cash flow is obviously what we're most interested in when we're thinking about keeping the doors open, and that's an absolutely imperative conversation. But what do you do when you have entered this new norm, as many of us have, where we are looking at this in terms of our interim and our longer term planning? So if you're like me at my institution, the Florence Griswold Museum in Old Lyme, Connecticut, you know that your budget that you set up for this year is probably completely irrelevant at this point. Your expectations of traditional forms of revenue, such as admissions or program fees, are probably totally out of whack with the actuals that you have been facing thus far and anticipate for the remainder of your fiscal year. You may have also lost contributions, but you also may be looking at new forms of contributions. So I do think that we want to make sure that we're looking at this through the lens that I introduced in our last session, which is that of sequential planning, which is, for me, the term that I use when I'm talking about how to plan in accordance with different steps rather than an all or nothing approach. So traditionally, when we're doing our annual budget, we have staff members gathering, or maybe it's just us, and we're putting together a draft of our expectations for the year. Rarely do we recommend that you actually go through a formal budget revision, which is probably the case that many of us are facing. Usually, you may use tools such as forecasting, quarterly reports, updates to your board and to your staff to talk about any fluctuations that were unforeseen or expected in terms of where your budget parameters were versus what your actual income is. So for those of you who have taken some of the budget courses that I teach with ASLH, we talk about how to build budgets for projects as well as your annual operating budget. And both are similar in that you are anticipating certain amounts of income as well as expenses, and then you recognize that there will be changes in your actual activity that you're recording. In a case like ours right now, where there is a major difference between expectation and longer term projections, this is the case that I would recommend a full formal budget revision. So what's the difference between just recording actual data that may be a little bit different and explaining it versus a formal budget revision? Well, a formal budget revision is that which must be approved, like your annual operating budget, by your board. So what you may want to do, if you haven't already, is to talk to a finance department if you are a large enough organization to have that, to talk to your treasurer, to talk to a finance committee, if that is also something that your organization has, and to visit the idea of doing a full budget revision. If you receive any pushback, what I would offer is that my rule of thumb is that I usually say if you're expecting more than a 10% differential in your original budget projections versus what you are foreseeing for the year, and you still have maybe 1 to 2 quarters left of the year minimum to do a budget revision. You don't want to be working according to a compass that is misdirected. And that's what you're doing with an operating budget that's out of date. Similarly, while this is to such an extent, this crisis that we're all facing right now, where I can't imagine that you would have any board members or any stakeholders that would question a change in direction, you also want to make sure that you are clarifying that this is a premeditated course of action that you are taking. So what you want to do is consider some of those questions that we asked about cash flow in our last session. And again, check out that recording if you would like. But essentially, you're looking at what are your core functions? What do you need in order to meet those needs and your mission in your organization? And then also, where are the expenses that you're cutting back? So often it's easy to just be thinking about income streams drying up and saying, oh my gosh, we just don't have what we were expecting for the year. But also a great place to start with rebuilding an operating budget for revision is to consider, where have the expectations of expenses changed? Were there special events that you no longer will hold, where you may net a certain amount, but that also is after a certain amount of expenses have gone out the door? So consider where you're cutting back. Are there certain utilities costs that have gone down with your closure thus far, or that you could anticipate in the summer months, for instance? Are there vendor relationships that you could revisit and say, look, we're not making use of this. Is there an opportunity for us to consider what our relationship could look like for the remainder of 2020? Doesn't matter if you're on a calendar year, an academic year, or if you're part of a non-museum parent organization. Budget revision is an important conversation to have that I would really encourage you to do. So start thinking about where the expenses have been cut back, and then that will help you understand where your needs will need to be met in terms of your income streams. And remember, as a refresher, we're generally looking at 3 forms of income, 3 avenues. You're looking at your earned revenue, your contributed income, and your institutional revenue, which is your institutional income, which is any endowment, reserve, or funds, any other funds that you have in the institution that you may be making use of. That may be another area that would change in a revised budget. For instance, you may say, well, geez, our expenses aren't going down, but we understand that we're going to have to plug the dam, so to speak, that we may need more income that we will be able to make from earnings or from contributions in this year. By doing a revised budget, you have the opportunity to frame that conversation proactively with your trustees, who may need to approve additional use of endowment, additional use of a cash reserve, or potential spend out of a cash reserve. And then also think about, have there been any relief options that you have been fortunate to receive? Were you successful in an application for a PPP loan? Were you successful in a state application? If that's the case, you will want to document how that is offsetting your operating needs for, let's say, 8 weeks, if it's the PPP program. So you want to be thinking about ways that you are creating a framework for your new normal, one that you can confidently present out on to your board, one that you can work with to understand your operating needs as you are facing the remainder of the year. So this is something where I know a lot of people would focus on salaries and say, wow, where are we cutting back? But when you're looking at expenses, when you're looking at activity, I would encourage you with this idea of sequential planning. While we understand that salaries make up a huge amount of our expenses and our operating needs per year, really be thinking about what you can do elsewhere to maintain your staff. As we're seeing, a lot of the relief programs are contingent upon maintenance of the staff, at least for a certain period of time. So this is something I would really encourage you to do at a more comprehensive institutional level. Again, feel free to ask any questions that you have in the Q&A, but I really want to encourage you to start with a budget revision as one of your first things that you're thinking about as you are continuing your operation for the foreseeable future. Don't think about it just in terms of the full annual budget. Also, make sure that you're looking at your individual program and project budget. Do you have capital expectations? Were you looking at doing improvements or preservation projects that you recognize are not necessarily a good idea, or you've already lost your spring window to complete those, and they will necessarily be deferred until next year? Make sure that you are able to encapsulate the activity that you foresee and the activity that you foresee not happening. That can also relieve your budget of some expectations that you realize are not going to take place in this budget cycle. Similarly, are there exhibitions? Are there certain initiatives that you also want to make sure that you are recalibrating? If you are recalibrating that at the departmental or the project level, think about how that reflects on your general annual operating budget. Remember that project budgets do not need to be approved by your board, but your annual operating budget, if you go through a major revision, does. So this is something that you would want to introduce and make sure that you're following proper governance with that. So I would say that you really want to be considering this in terms of what you're looking at for, as we talked about, the income streams of endowment or other institutional funds, your earnings and how that may be decreasing, and then also looking at it in terms of contributions. As I mentioned with the sequential approach, think about this in terms of what we're looking at as we're considering business resumption. As many of you have probably heard by this point, all of the states are looking at something that is most likely going to be a graduated business resumption model, right? So we don't expect that June 30th, we're all closed, and July 1st, we're all open, and we're back up to speed. That is not what we are anticipating in this case. So what we really want to be doing is looking at what our activity levels are going to look like for an extended period of time. So there are two major points that I want to make with this. The first is related to our conversation about budget revision. Also be sure to be considering what your next fiscal year budget will be looking at. The ramifications of the crisis are not going to just be impacting this year's budget and then concluding at the end of the calendar year. We all recognize that there may be another outbreak, that we may still be dealing with people getting comfortable with their philanthropic activities. We may be dealing with people out of work for an extended period of time, and that will impact our operations, our income streams, and our overall sustainability for at least a couple of fiscal years. So I would encourage you to really revisit your currently approved operating budget and any associated project and departmental budgets. Then I would also encourage you to already start thinking about your next fiscal year. Some of us are in a situation where our fiscal year begins July 1, others it's in the second half of the year, and many of us it's in the calendar year. Start thinking about the next 18 months. What will you be able to say with confidence will be taking place in the next 18 months? Where do you still want to hedge your bets and be conservative? I would recommend being conservative in terms of your income, and then also being realistic in terms of your operating needs. And don't forget, if you defer something from your 2020 budget, where is it needing to be addressed in a future operating budget? So for instance, if you have deferred maintenance, you were planning on doing a major spring project, you recognize that that is not going to happen this year, so you decide to put that rehabilitation project on the docket for spring of 2021, that will need to be addressed in that budget. So again, this is 101, but sometimes it's really hard to react to change adequately, and it can be even harder to document this. So these are the things that you want to be thinking about, right? So the second point along with that is this concept of sequential planning, not just in terms of one fiscal year versus the next, but also thinking about this in terms of timeline of activity and this kind of tiered reopening that we recognize that we're going to be looking at. So we all need to be preparing for a leveled approach to reentry. For many of us in the state of Connecticut, I'll say, we've been informed that as of May 20th, we can reopen the grounds of our sites, but not our interior spaces. We are completely responsive in all of our situations to federal orders, to governor's executive orders within our specific states. That obviously will be defining our courses of action to a certain extent. We obviously are valuing the health, safety, security of all of our visitors. What I do recommend is, while the dates may change for each of us in our different states, and we may not have full clarity on that right now, consider the remaining time in your full closure to be one of planning, to be thinking about what the components of reopening will mean for you. So one thing that has been coming up in a lot of conversations that I've had about this leveled reentry is, what exactly does it mean? We've seen other countries already start to implement it with varying degrees of success. I've seen museums in Shanghai, as I brought up before, that I really think have done a good job with issuing visitor expectations. And these are the kind of things that we're going to be doing here. Are you going to be looking at timed entries? Are you going to be looking at reservations in advance? Are you going to be looking at certain capacity limits where maybe you will only accept 25% of your listed visitor capacity in your galleries at any given time, or in your house museum? So these are the things that you need to be thinking about, some of which you will receive direction from your state agencies. Others you will not, and you will have to kind of pay attention to what the field is doing, and then also be looking at that in terms of what's appropriate for your institution. Martha asked a question If you're in the middle of a director search, should you include those expenses within the operating budget? I would recommend that you do. What I typically recommend in terms of budgets, especially if there's something that's a specific project or pocket, I like to see that addressed in the operating budget, but also to break it out into a specific project budget. So you may have those expenses in your operating budget and acknowledged. You can even put a note at the bottom and say, we expect higher development and administration costs because we're doing a search right now. That's really common. But then you also may have a separate budget that further specifies the specific funding sources for your director search, maybe operating income, but you may have received donations for it, or you may be using a fund that the museum has, and then issuing all the specific expenses for that initiative. I recommend this for exhibitions. I recommend it for capital projects. Anything that's out of the norm from your operating budget, I think that you want to make sure that you are putting together its own specific document so that your board can follow that most easily. It's also really helpful if you're doing an exhibition or an education program that you received external funding for. It's an easy way for you to manage those project budgets. So let me know if you have more questions on that. But my heart goes out to you, Martha. This is a very difficult time to be doing a director search. So best of luck with that. And so as we're talking about the activity levels to be modeling, this is really what we're talking about, is to work within scenario building and financial modeling, is that you want to be thinking about what levels of activity can you be expecting. You may want to, and this could really inform your annual operating budget, by the way, that you are revising. What happens if you are able to reopen in June and to only accept 25% of your capacity for the remainder of the year? What if you could start with 25% for 3 months and then the remaining 6 months allow 50 or 75%? What if you are doing a special event in September that usually, let's say it's a ticketed event, usually are able to sell 150 tickets? What if you're only able to sell 75? When we talk about the sequential planning approach, we're talking about it in terms of an understanding of the trajectory being a stepped trajectory back to activity. It is not one and done, and the best bet that you can do is to be conservative. You may be able to do a full event in September. My fingers are crossed that we're able to do our full event in September for our benefit auction here at the museum. But recognizing that may not be the case, consider what your plan Bs will be. Consider what your necessary outcomes are. Do you need to be planning on doing a raffle instead of doing an event? If you're doing an auction, is there a way to move it online? And here's something that you should also be considering. Are there systems, if you are to move online, that you're going to have to invest in? You may want to be thinking about that with everyone. So I do think that every situation that you could face, we do not know that yet. So you may have impatient board members or staff members or colleagues that say, gosh, when are we going to know the answers? We may not, but the best thing that we can do from a financial and resource management perspective is to plan very, very conservatively. So again, I would encourage you to consider these modeling options. Consider if you're doing 25%, 50%, 75%. In terms of all your earned revenue, particularly admissions, but also what your needs may be if you were to move programs online, if you were to go for some kind of virtual program instead of an in-person program. That's, I think, something that will be really helpful. Heather also offered in the chat here that there is going to be a town hall discussion that NEMA is hosting on reopening museums beyond when to how. So I'm sure a lot of these things will be covered more in depth there, and that will be a really, really useful resource for all of us. I'm sure one of the things that will be talked about in that town hall is the concept of a business continuity plan. If you haven't already done this, consider that business continuity and business resumption planning is absolutely inclusive of financial modeling, as we were just talking about, and then also be thinking about it in terms of greater systems at large, which are absolutely related to financial needs. We talked about in the first session the inclusion of business interruption needs in your disaster preparedness and emergency planning document. So you obviously should have an emergency planning and disaster preparedness plan. If you don't already, I encourage you to look into that. NEMA has some great resources. The AAM and AASLH STEPS programs are also really great for looking into that. So just to do a brief recap of what we talked about in the first session about business interruption, was to consider determination of your core functions and your essential staff. What is the bare bones skeletal framework for moving forward at the very least? How will you establish communications, structure, and expectations during a closure? The importance of running scenario planning as you are suspending some of these typical income streams, and also recognizing where the business impacts will be and analyzing that for your organization. And then also something I would include is reviewing your governance needs. What's your reporting structure to your board and your communication? Would you typically go to your entire board for an approval, but given the time-sensitive nature for some of the things in our closure, could you affirm with your board that you will go simply to your executive committee? Would you want to update your bylaws if they are not already updated to allow for virtual meetings and to allow for proxy votes and to allow for remote voting? That may be something that you consider. We're hitting annual meeting season. That may be something that you need to do. All of those tips for business disruption apply for business resumption as well. Think about what your core functions are. What will you be starting with immediately? For instance, if you're anything like me, we're thinking a lot right now about what extra activity we will need to entertain in terms of cleaning the museum. Cleaning before visitors arrive and after they leave. What do we need to do to be mindful of our collection spaces as we undergo more rigorous cleaning procedures? So these are things that we're looking at both in terms of what our needs are, where we need to make sure that we're staffed. Are there increased vendor agreements that we need to make, we either will be introducing for the first time or that we will be elevating given these needs? And where's the financial impact on that? So you're thinking both in terms of staff time and you're thinking of the actual oversight. Also, are there products that we need to buy? Are you going to invest in hand sanitizer stations? Are you going to be handing out masks to your visitors? Are you going to be putting up additional signage directing visitors? We talked about systems orientation earlier, and the idea there are more online systems you may need to have. Do you have a way for people to buy tickets in advance? Do you have a way for people to pay not using cash? Many of us are aware that they're trying to avoid cash transactions as much as possible. I'm not saying this to inundate you, but rather think about what's appropriate for your organization, your activity, your scale, and be thinking about it in terms of what is the most important things for you to be considering when you think about what a reopening means for you. So that's why I say make sure that you're looking at these core functions. What do you need to be doing in order to undergo these core functions safely? And then are there financial implications for that? Make sure that you have that communication structure as you're looking at business resumption. Is this something where you have a staff and you need to make sure that you're understanding within your teams internally how all of that is being worked out? Are there department plans that are being drafted that are all being compared to each other and need to be really kind of coalesced into one general institutional plan and communicated out to everyone? So that's one form of internal planning. Also, what about your committees? What about your volunteers? Thinking about the ways that you're going to reintegrate them absolutely is part of your business resumption. All of these are vital to making our nonprofit organizations run. So when we're talking about this from a financial management standpoint, operations are not only about what costs money, they're about where are we creating and maintaining those stakeholder relationships. So you want to be thinking about your donors, your volunteers, your committee members, your trustees, and bringing that all together as well. Again, the scenario planning, as we talked about, is vital at every single stage of this. This may be something that you want to be going through monthly with your finance committee or your finance director and working out that way. And again, the governance needs. This may be something where your board meetings for the remainder of the year will not be in person. Are you able to entertain those, as well as time-sensitive needs? Do you have a sequence of events in terms of how, if you need to reach into your endowment, how is that approval being handled? This all should be part of your, let's say, endowment distribution policy in that case, or part of your bylaws or your governing documents. But also make sure that you're affirming those systems. This is so vital, and if you are facing any kind of changes in how you're managing your endowment, obviously you're reaching out to the Attorney General. You want to be as proactive as possible and make sure that you are being as transparent as you can, because when it comes to your annual reporting out to your membership, if you're a membership organization, if it comes to doing your annual audit, if you do an annual audit, these are all things that you want to make sure that you can be held accountable for confidently. So think about all of that. Also be thinking about the resumption needs, not just of every department and in terms of your core function, but think about this in terms of how you're bringing this into future planning. So it's not just about business resumption right now, but whether or not we hit another outbreak of this virus, or you may have another crisis situation that you have to manage in the future, make sure that you're documenting all of your procedures right now. Consider, are there elements of this that you want to put into your personnel policy? How are you managing remote work? How are people responsible for asking for time off? How are people responsible for handling accounts payables, accounts receivables within their department, and then with the greater organization? So all of those financial protocols that we talked about last session, making sure that you're able to sustain those. Maybe that's something that you want to either be updating job descriptions to say, see crisis protocol, and those are additional expectations for those jobs. Also make sure that the communications are as strong as possible. Crisis planning is obviously something that when we think about it, we've always thought about it in terms of maybe a weather emergency or something happening in your town. Rarely have we thought about this kind of more protracted situation that we're dealing with right now. But it doesn't mean you handle it any differently. Maybe you want to do tabletop exercises every couple of years with your staff. Bring this into orientation for your trustees as well as for your new staff members. And think about the ways that you can constantly be making your communication better. Well, you may say, well, gee whiz, Becky, that's not exactly financial. Remember that your financial procedures are the core of your organization. You are a business just like any other, nonprofit or for-profit, and you need to be making sure that every activity that has a financial implication is well planned for, well executed, documented, and handled according to all of your financial needs. So this is just as vital as everything else in terms of your disaster planning. If you're doing a tabletop exercise about disaster planning, your finance director or your director or your board president, whoever is going to wear this hat, needs to be responsible for saying, and what happens if we lose our payroll system? And what happens if this goes down? What happens if we can't get to the bank? What is the proper protocol for that? So you definitely want to make sure that you're bringing that in. And as we said, that really relates to your longer term planning. And now this isn't just this fiscal period, this particular circumstance in which we find ourselves, but it's one in which we just can't emphasize enough that whether or not this continues in the longer term, or this is just something that helps us really acclimate to these kind of protracted situations, consider how this is going to relate to this fiscal year and to potential activity in the future. So for instance, when, as we were talking about earlier with the annual operating budget, look at 2021, look at 2022. Are you going to have payroll and or hiring freezes that you need to be planning for? Maybe you'll have a suspension of professional development, or as I said earlier, capital projects that aren't absolutely necessary. What are the potential cancellations of programs and events? We talked about this year, but are you aware that maybe you do a major winter gala in February and there is just no way that you're going to be comfortable planning for that? That's one of those areas that you also want to be considering in terms of the longer term planning. So we need to be thinking about all of those initiatives as well as our operations. We need to be thinking about the timeline, this kind of graduated reopening. We need to be thinking about our core functions, our essential needs. Don't forget mission in that conversation. Something I can't emphasize enough is the relationship between mission and your operations and your finances. Something that can get lost right now as we have to adapt is mission. Think about, is your mission something that you are still fulfilling through all of the needs that you are meeting right now? Similarly, looking ahead, are there different ways that you will be activating your mission in the future based on changing visitor needs? The expectations that you have had in terms of financial activities, programs, events, fundraisers, for example, your membership messaging, your annual appeal messaging. Maybe you're even doing a special fundraising initiative to offset operating losses right now, like a preparedness fund. How is that going to change your expectations as you're looking at longer term planning? Are you going to be revising your program schedule? Are you going to be revising your messaging in such a way where you say, wow, you know, we have really become an area of respite as much as a museum of education and history. We need to really understand how we can best benefit the needs of the community right now. I've read some wonderful pieces lately on kind of talking about our zombie identity and the fact that who we were 6 months ago is most likely not who we're going to be 6 months from now for each institution. Think about for your community, where you are, who you're serving, how you want to grow that service area. And is that something where you anticipate in your longer term planning, both in terms of your financial operating plans, as we talked about with your budgets, but also your longer term strategic planning for your institution, something that you're going to be bringing in and potentially introducing to your community? Will your stakeholders be asking for different outcomes from your programs? Will you apply for a grant from a local foundation and they want to say, what are you doing to handle post-crisis community orientation? These are all things that you should be thinking about that absolutely are going to have an impact on and be impacted by your financial planning. So I would just really encourage, you know, this is something that I talk about in some of the different things that I do, and the way that we talk about it here at the Florence Griswold is to already be considering how we're reorienting ourselves and where are the financial implications of that. And I would really encourage you to be considering that as well, and to really be looking at this through a lens of mission and institutional policy. What will your voice be as you are looking forward? And on that note, I want to make sure that we also talk about communication. And this is for two reasons. One is just general comfort and transparency. The other is still continuing to recognize that we're in the public trust and what are our duties throughout that. So obviously it's most important to be keeping in touch with your trustees at this time. All of us have either boards of our organization, or we are responsive to a larger parent organization, museum or not. Maybe it's a municipality, maybe it is a university. Regardless of what that may be, the reporting out is just as vital as it's ever been. Let's say that you're at an academic museum and you say, well, you know, I don't have a board, I don't have an advisory council, I'm not really responsible to reaching out to anyone right now. Okay, that may be your situation. What I would recommend is still to be documenting all of the procedures that you are undertaking right now. Let's not forget that all museums are publicly facing institutions. Whether you are involved in a municipality, an academic environment, or you're in your own standalone 501c3 position, you are going to be responsible for reaching out to the public in a way that potentially those parent organizations are not. Also be keeping in mind that if you have applied for any of the relief funding, there's a strong chance that you are going to have to be reporting out on your activity during this time. So you want to make sure that your internal financial records are maintained just according to the highest standard, as they always are, I'm sure, but also provide some narrative for yourself, even if it's just keeping a file folder in your office or a running email in your drafts folder on what are you doing And this is both in terms of what are you doing in terms of your financial procedures so that your oversight is as strong as ever, but then also what are you doing in terms of your outreach? How have you adapted your procedures and how are you planning for the future? Okay, so consider that. What are you doing that's typical? What's the outreach? How you're adapting and what your plans are. These are questions you should be prepared to answer as you are reporting up to trustees or a governing board or a governing agency. As you are going into reporting out to many of your funding organizations, your individual donors, or even if you're doing endowment reports, let's say you're doing stewardship reports for funds that are institutional. These are all questions that are really relevant to our situation right now. And adaptability is something that people are expecting. Don't be concerned about that. But you want to be communicative. You don't want to say, oh, everything was fine. That's the fishiest thing that you can say. Make sure that you are actually addressing this and be proactive about it. So obviously on your board, let's say that you're working within a traditional 501c3 structure or a foundation structure and you have a board to which you are reporting. Doesn't matter where you are in your organization. You could be a department lead, you could be the director, you could say, well, I'm a collections manager, but things are starting to change for me and I should probably document it, do it. What is ultimately always important with our organizations is that we are keeping in touch with our resource management and allocation with treasurer, finance committee, investment committee. Maybe you're hitting the time for your audit and you're working on that with an audit committee. So you have that financial body. If you're not communicating regularly with them in terms of your resource management, your asset portfolio, understanding where all that is, set up a meeting and get all those people on the phone together. I have found that's one of the most useful things that we're doing at the Florence Griswold Museum is that we have a bi-weekly meeting where we get together our treasurer and we get together our financially minded trustees. And it's an opportunity for them to share expertise that I may not have thought of. It's an opportunity for me to share the state of the field and to be talking through relief options, where we are, what our status is, and to be reviewing cash flow together. It's been a great way to share our expertise in a really productive way. Also, to be able to go to my larger board or to be able to go to less financially minded trustees who may say, how's the museum doing? Should we be worried? And to say, you know, don't worry. We have these people attending to it. We're keeping in very close contact. Communication can be one of your best tools during this time, even if you feel like you don't know the answers to everything. Letting people know that the right people are having the conversation can be great. This may even require just talk to your bank, or you may talk to an investment manager. Make use of the relationships you have and consider what new ones you need to establish. This may give you a new lens on your governance protocols, and you may say, wow, I'm really learning that we need to keep in better contact about this. That may be something you learn. That's okay. These are skills that you can bring forward. So consider your trustees, both the financially minded ones, those that are not as financially minded. Consider your executive committee, as we talked about earlier with governance adaptation. Is there an opportunity for you to be working more regularly with your executive committee if it's easier for you to get approvals that way? Consider your board as a whole, providing updates to them, and also are there bylaws revisions you may need to meet that you understand will be necessary in the future to undertake your business remotely? And then also make sure that you're working, if you have a board, in tandem with your board president. Unified leadership is really important. People take comfort in stability right now. We want to make sure that as we face issues, we are being open about them, but also the strengths that we have, we want to trumpet those. One of the best strengths that you can have is unified leadership with a board president. And so if you're in a board position and you're thinking about how you can help your organization, or likewise you're in a staff position, you think about how you can help your organization as well, think about how you can be working together to make sure that that's the strongest unification that you can provide. So who might be asking you these questions if they're not your trustees? Well, it may be your major donors. Your major donors may be reaching out to you and saying, what's going on? Should I be concerned? I made a pledge, or I didn't make a pledge, but I'd like to make one. I'd like to go to this, or I'd like it to go to that. Your development office or your development officer, or you, if you're in a small organization and it's just one person, this is a vital time to make sure that you are staying in communication with everyone. There's a couple of points that I'd like to make on that. Make sure that you have a structure for people to give, both in terms of your typical structures, don't abandon any, but make sure that those are there. But also, is there a way for people to give to offset some of these operating losses? Maybe they're aware that you have had to cancel a special event, or they foresee that coming, and they would like to participate in giving, though they won't be able to buy a ticket. Is there an option for that person? Similarly, does someone typically give a certain amount for their annual fund gift? They would like to split it up and make sure that it can go to a fund that can immediately help you, as well as those general annual expenses. Make sure that you offer that. This is a time to be flexible. The best development and fundraising professionals I see are the ones that are able to pivot, the ones that are able to be flexible and responsive. This is a great time to build that up with people. I would also encourage you to make sure that you're reaching out individually. You may have a community where people love to get phone calls. You may have a community where people like handwritten messages. I happen to be in the latter. I've been in a position, for example, where every week, like clockwork, I write 10 cards. I write 10 cards to our longest serving donors, longest serving volunteers, to donors, trustees. But you know what? I don't ask for anything. I just tell them how well we're doing at the museum. We're making a valiant effort to keep up with everything. We can't wait to welcome them back. This is the best time for you to leverage strong relationships and to continue to grow strong relationships. If you can avoid it, I would avoid direct asks right now. I've seen other people have a different opinion on that. But for me, this is a great time to make sure that you have strong relationship with those stakeholders, whether they're representatives from government agencies, from private foundations and structured giving agencies, and then also individuals. It's a great time to be reaching out to people and let them know how committed you are to the museum, and to say thank you, and to let them know that you're thinking of them. That has been one of the best things that I have seen, and hopefully you will get some gifts out of that, but you're not putting the pressure on. This is a difficult time for us all, and being empathetic is one of the best things that we can do on the institutional side. Similarly with your membership, reach out, be honest, say, this is a tough time for us all. Here's what we can do for you, and here's what we would ask for from you. And what you can do is simply put out, again, soft ask. Here is a way that you can support us. And I found that that is a really successful way to do it. Also consider, will you be updating your membership structure? For those of us who are, I think all of us, going through this extended closure, will you offer to your members that anyone who renews a membership will have a 16-month membership, or anyone that renewed in March will get their membership extended by the extent of the closure? And those are a couple of options that you can explore. And also, from the financial perspective, make sure you're linking that back to both your expectations for membership income for this year, and then for the next membership cycle, if you're doing any kind of extension. Your committee leadership, your volunteers, are you reaching out to them? Are they understanding the new routines? Are they understanding new expectations? If you have a committee that is planning an event for October, do they understand that this may need to be revised according to any state guidelines that change, and that may have an impact on that project budget? It may have an impact on the parameters, and it may also have an impact if this is, let's say, a fundraising event, and ticket prices or expectations with vendors. If it's a benefit auction, let's say, where you solicit your community, what are you doing if those community members aren't able to give like they are in the past? Small business owners may not be as generous as they've been in the past. What are ways that you can support the local businesses? That may be something to consider. All of these people, all of these constituent groups, from your trustees to your volunteers, to your community members, to your membership, and the public at large, they need to feel valued, okay? That is most important. It is better for you to have a rough year, this financial year, but to sustain and to be able to build those relationships for the future, and to say, this is what we were able to offer you in 2020. Thank you for being with us. Here's our exciting future. Think about your longer term messaging, like we were talking about earlier. That absolutely will be vital in donor cultivation for the remainder of 2020, and most likely for the next couple of years as well. So I would really encourage that. And of course, don't forget your staff. As we were talking about earlier in terms of business disruption and business resumption planning, understanding your core functions and your essential staff is vital from an operational perspective. But I think we all agree that as you may be defining essential staff for the purposes of core operations, you also want to be understanding how everyone beyond that essential staff is responding to this issue. Pressures will be different for every staff member. You want to understand what their expectations are, what their comfort levels are, because not only will that impact how you're able to resume business, and I'm sure this is something that will go into the town hall, that consistent messaging, just like that unification with your trustees, will speak volumes for your community to have your staff invested in the next directions of your institution. So I can't emphasize that enough, that there is actually a functional level in terms of planning for reentry of your staff and administrative oversight, but it also can work wonders in terms of community building internally and externally. So as you can see today, we covered a lot of ground, some of which was directly financially minded and some which had financial implications in terms of planning. So we were able to talk through budget revisions and how you should approach that for the remainder of 2020 or your current fiscal year. And then also how to be looking at that for the next 1 or even 2 fiscal cycles. How to be looking at it in terms of project planning and any deferred projects that you also want to be accounting for. Talked about it in terms of longer term institutional planning and how to make sure that your activities will be one that are reflecting your mission and how your mission may be reflecting new activities, and also how to be considering that from a financial planning perspective. And then we also talked about some of this timeline preparation, sequential planning, and the concept of the tiered reopening and how to model that and how to be considering that from a very conservative income perspective, but a realistic expense perspective, and how to be managing that. And then lastly, we talked about communication structures with stakeholders internally and externally, both for the purposes of transparency and public trust, and also for stakeholder relationships in the future. So that's all I have for you. I see it's 11:53. I have 7 minutes left. If there are any questions, ask away. Heather, I see you're back with me here.
I've been here all along.
No, there you are. There you are. I'm not alone in the room.
No, you're not alone.
So if anybody has anything, please feel free to let me know. Heather, I had shared with you a resource list before our first talk that absolutely is relevant for this group as well. And you know, I have had people follow up after these calls just with questions that their treasurer may have or they as a director may have. I am here for you, absolutely. If you just need somebody outside your organization to run an idea by for 10 minutes, feel free to reach out. I think everyone has my contact info, and Heather can share that with everyone. Oh, and I see that there are a couple of questions that came in at the end, so I'm happy to share that. How to announce successful PPP to our community. Annie, first of all, congrats on your successful application. Woo! We got one at the Flow Grids. Heather, I know that the NEMA organization also got one. So this is really exciting. And I think that you should definitely share it in a way that is extremely positive. Of course, don't overstate it that now everything is good. This is an intermediary measure to help us sustain and to bridge operations for a certain amount of time. But what I would really recommend, Annie, is sending out a notice to your membership, to your mailing list. Do a special email to your board, maybe before that, and to say, everyone, I just want to share with you, we received this. You can provide some more details on the funding amount to your board. But the messaging should be the same, that this is a sign of the strength and the vitality of your organization, that you were able to successfully secure PPP funding, and that this is what it will provide for you. So if your organization is like mine, it provides 8 weeks of staff support to clarify that this will provide vital bridge funding for the remainder of the closure and hopefully the early weeks of a reopening plan. And then I would also leverage that to say, here's what we received. This is a stamp of approval of the great job we're doing. Here's how you can help. As I talked about that soft ask, do you want to create a structure for people to offset those operating losses with a gift? That could be a great soft ask opportunity. And then also, what are you offering your community in the meantime? Can they come to your grounds? Is there virtual programming? Can they keep in touch in social media? Make it clear that you are a resource to continue to be patronized during this time. An anonymous attendee asks, can you recommend a percentage by which I should decrease my funding expectations? And you offer 25%. I would say 25% is pretty low. What we've actually seen is that there are fundraising decreases both in the current fiscal year of a crisis as well as the next year. Those seem to be the 2 years that are hit the hardest, and then after that they start the regrowth period. So for instance, when the financial crisis happened in 2008, 2009, the first year saw a relatively modest decrease in fundraising. The next year saw that doubled. Okay. And this is something that you can see a lot of think tanks actually talk about. So people become more reticent to give the year after a crisis when they feel like they need to be maintaining their resources a little bit more strongly. So I would say two things. First is, as I've been saying, make sure that you're planning for successive years of financial projections. So you're looking at this year, and then you're also looking at least 2021, if not 2022. In terms of decreasing your fundraising expectations. You offer 25% here. Anonymous attendee, I don't know who you are, but not knowing your community, think about what's reasonable. Some may see a 25% decrease, some may see something like a 50 or a 60% decrease. I would encourage you to do modeling for those different levels. You can do all of those. That's something internal, that's a great procedure to follow. So take a look at what your budget, what needs would be met with a 25% decrease in fundraising. Take a look at 50% and then kind of work it out that way. I'll give you a heads up. We're looking here at about 35% decrease in fundraising. That seems to be a rule of thumb that I've heard others are doing, but there is no right answer. It is reliant on your fundraising modeling and your community. So there's just some thoughts to offer on how you're thinking about that.
Becky, also, I have a follow-up on one of the governance things that you mentioned with annual meetings coming up and board meetings. I know the state of Massachusetts has actually instituted some emergency requirements about that. So they've set up different requirements for how do you vote for the annual meeting, how you set up your board meetings, because everything's electronic now instead of in person. So definitely check with your state government, the changes on that one, because it does impact you. So basically it kind of supersedes your bylaws in a lot of ways. I know with like the quorums, with the board meetings and stuff like that. So that has changed, but it's only for a temporary time. So I definitely check with your state and stuff like that to see if they have any emergency measures currently in place.
You're absolutely right. Connecticut has done the same thing here, where they've issued some new measures. That's a great conversation to have with your council as well, because they should be keeping up on that, and they can help direct you in terms of what's appropriate for your organization, in keeping with those temporary, I would say, relaxations on some of the in-person requirements and quorum requirements. So I would definitely encourage you. That's something we're doing at the Flow Grids. We're working hand in hand with our council to really see what's appropriate for us. And it also may really impact how you want to be looking at your bylaws in the future to consider how your organization is prepared to handle such needs. Yep, totally agree.
Yep, just on that one. And then I know with us, this is more a personal one because our fiscal year ends in July. So we have like 2 months left. Do we update our budget, or do we just keep it the same and just start looking at 21?
Yeah, and see, I said earlier, and like I said, there's no hard and fast rule. And Heather, you and I have talked about budget revisions in the past. Is that, as you know, I tend to go with a 10% difference as a rule of thumb. I'd say when you're in the last quarter of a fiscal year, it's less helpful. It's less helpful to do a full budget revision, because what you're really trying to do is reconcile your original expectations with your new ones, and in a way that you see the actuals just skewing off the table. So I know there are some people that started a new budget on April 1st. That's definitely a budget revision. If you are concluding in June, or let's say you're on an academic year budget, where you may not be in charge of that, but you've already submitted your expectations for the year because you do it in February. You want to be proactively having that conversation, whatever the organizational structure is. So for instance, looking at it with an organization that's in the last 2 to 3 months, I would say last quarter of their fiscal year. I wouldn't necessarily recommend a budget revision right now, but if you haven't approved your budget yet for the coming fiscal year, you'll want to update that before doing so. If you have already accepted your budget with your governing body, you will want to revise that one. So that's what I would offer at this point.
Sounds good. So we are at 12:01. Does anybody have any last minute questions before we sign off for today? Go ahead and type them in. But Becky, I want to say thank you again for doing part 2. It's lots of help. I always enjoy going to these things. So
I am here to help, whatever you need.
As you can tell, I'm the numbers person. So
I love it. I think it's great. I have some of my best conversations with Heather.
All right, so I want to just remind everybody that today was recorded and will be available through the NEMA website along with the town hall that Becky mentioned earlier. We do have a lot of other great programming coming up, so definitely join us for that. And if you do have any suggestions, go ahead, contact one of the NEMA staff for town hall, webinar. We're up for anything. So we just want to make sure that we keep learning and extending our reach and stuff like that. So thank you, Becky, and thank you for everybody. Do you have any final words, Becky, before we sign off?
Just thank you, Heather, and thanks to everyone at NEMA for continuing to connect us all and provide these resources. I benefit from them as much as everyone else. So I'm really proud to be a trustee of NEMA and to see everything that we're able to push forward. So thank you for that.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And we will sign off and we will see you at a next webinar or town hall. Thanks, everybody. Bye.